Hey there, Night Owl. Tonight we begin with something a little less academic and a lot more herbal. A trip through the foggy, fragrant world of medieval intoxication. Yes, they did it. But trust me, things got weird and sometimes surprisingly creative. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as a grim, mud-covered parade of monks, plagues and potatoes. But under all that wool and despair, there were people, regular, flawed, experimental people, who occasionally looked at a strange root and thought, well, let's see what happens if I drink this with hot wine. And to be fair, who could blame them? There was no electricity, no coffee, nor antidepressants. The local entertainment was either watching a knight try to read or wondering how long your neighbor could keep dancing before collapsing from ergot poisoning. So if someone told you there was a mushroom that made you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you'd probably chew it too. Contrary to modern assumptions, the concept of using substances to expand the mind, escape pain, or simply make one's day slightly less horrible wasn't rare. It was baked right into the culture. But it wasn't called getting high. There were no medieval stoner duos giggling behind the haystacks. It was wrapped in terms like visionary states, divina inspiration, pain relief, or in extreme cases, doctors used herbs, monks grew them, witches, depending on who you asked, applied them, and almost everyone encountered these substances in some form, through medicine, ritual, or accidental consumption of moldy bread. Again, the range of medieval intoxicants wasn't limited to a tankard of warm ale, though that helped. They had roots that screamed, flowers that blurred vision, seeds that induced prophetic dreams, and ointments that made people believe they were flying naked through the sky with Satan's catering team. Your breathing slows naturally now as you settle deeper into your pillow. Getting high wasn't necessarily recreational. It was medicinal, spiritual, or sometimes just very poor judgment on an empty stomach. And depending on your social rank, it might have been delivered by a barber, nun, or a barefoot peasant named Wolf, who learned it from a very wise squirrel. In the medieval world, you didn't need a shady back alley or a velvet-roped club to get your hands on mind-altering substances. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a vague disregard for dosage. Because in those days, nature was the dealer, and she wasn't always gentle. Medieval Europe was overflowing with plants, roots, fungi, and resins that could either cure your headache or make you believe you'd married a tree. The line between medicine and mystical trip was, let's say, artistically interpreted. Physicians, monks, midwives, and wandering herbalists all dabbled in botany with varying levels of training and enthusiasm. If you wanted something to knock you out, calm your nerves, or make you see God in your soup, they had options. Take henbane, for example. This plant was like nature's version of Russian roulette. Properly prepared, it eased pain and brought on sleep. Improperly prepared, It introduced you to an entirely new set of problems, like convulsions and a strong desire to remove your own shoes while running through the woods screaming. Settling deeper into comfort now. Let the story wash over you. O mandrake, the root shaped vaguely like a human figure. Legends said it screamed when pulled from the ground, a noise so lethal it could kill a man. That didn't stop people from digging it up anyway, usually by tying it to a dog and standing far away. Ingesting mandrake could induce unconsciousness, vision, and on a good day, prophetic dreams. On a bad day, well, you wouldn't be needing herbs anymore. Then there was belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, which is exactly the kind of name that screams, maybe not. It was used to dilate pupils for beauty, but also to treat pain, cause hallucination, and, on occasion, death. Medieval self-care was a bold business. These herbs were often combined into teas, tinctures, oils, or those famous flying ointments we'll get to soon. And they weren't always consumed voluntarily. Sometimes they were applied during religious ceremonies, medical procedures, or by a well-meaning apothecary who thought a little extra root can't hurt. But hurt it could. Your muscles relax completely as ancient wisdom flows through the darkness. Henbane, the medieval equivalent of let's see what this button does, known to botanists as Hiosciamus niger, and to everyone else as the stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was a duck. Henbane was a staple of the Middle Ages, unofficial pharmacy, used across Europe for centuries. Henbane wasn't just a casual plant. It was a mood. Monks recorded its properties in herbals. Physicians used it to dull pain. Witches used it to ride broomsticks through their imaginations. And peasants mostly hoped not to eat it by accident. So what exactly did henbane do? Well, that depends. In small doses. It acted as a sedative. It could ease toothaches, help with insomnia, and make childbirth slightly less traumatic. In other words, it was the medieval version of take two and try not to scream. But in larger doses, or just poorly timed ones, henbane could cause delirium, hallucination, wild agitation, and in some cases, a heartfelt conversation with a turnip you thought was your deceased grandmother. It contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, which interfere with neurotransmitters in the brain. To put it non-scientifically, your medieval brain gets weird fast. Visual distortions, disorientation, dry mouth, extreme thirst, and spontaneous outbursts of interpretive dance were all on the menu. Henbane was often smoked, brewed into teas, or even combined with fat and smeared on the skin. A popular delivery method for anyone who didn't like their consciousness arranged in a linear fashion. Now, was it legal? Technically, yes. Controlled substances weren't a thing yet, but it was controversial, especially with the church. Anything that altered perception was suspicious. Visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs. Still, henbane had fans among healers, mystics, and people with nothing to lose. It even made its way into beer recipes before being banned in favor of safer additives like hop. Drifting deeper now into peaceful rest, few plants in the medieval world were as feared, revered, and dramatically misunderstood as mandrake, a root so potent and weirdly human-shaped that it sparked a mix of botany, folklore, and sheer panic, botanically known as Mandragora officinarum. The mandrake was associated with sleep, hallucination, fertility, and a high probability of either mystical visions or waking up in a ditch next to a confused goat. Either way, something happened. Medieval herbalists believed that the root, which often resembled a stubby, contorted human figure, contained powerful magical and medicinal properties. It was a sedative, an anesthetic, an aphrodisiac, and, according to some, a conduit to prophetic dreams. You could boil it in wine to calm pain, or you could inhale its fumes and immediately question all your life decisions. But the real fame of the mandrake came from its alleged habit of screaming when uprooted. Yes, screaming, as in don't pull me out of the dirt or you'll die from the noise kind of screaming. Medieval texts warned that simply hearing the mandrake's cry could kill a man, which naturally led to some creative harvesting techniques. The most famous involved tying the root to a dog, walking away, and letting the poor animal do the dirty work. The assumption was that the dog would die instead of you, a plan that raises some ethical red flags, even by medieval standards. Once harvested and the dog properly mourned, the mandrake could be dried, powdered, steeped, or worn as a charm. Some people even carried tiny mandrake figures in pouches to ward off evil or promote fertility. Because nothing says romance like a mummified root that sounds like it's seen things. Your breathing becomes slower and deeper now. The church predictably didn't love mandrakes. Anything that caused visions and wasn't tied to organized religion was treated as witchcraft adjacent. Still, monks recorded mandrake recipes in herbals with suspiciously detailed instructions. Used correctly, mandrake could dull pain before surgery, treat insomnia, and create trippy, vivid dreams. Used incorrectly, it could cause vomiting, unconsciousness, or your family staging an exorcism because you thought your soup was whispering. Let's say you were a medieval noblewoman hoping to attract attention at a feast. You could wear your best linen. You could braid flowers into your hair. Or, if you were really serious, you could drip literal poison into your eyes. Enter belladonna, also known as atropa belladonna, or more honestly, deadly nightshade. The name alone sounds like a final boss in a medieval RPG. And yes, it was both alluring and lethal, the botanical equivalent of a seductive but unstable ex. The name belladonna means beautiful lady, because when a few drops of its extract were added to the eyes, it dilated the pupils. Wide eyes were considered attractive, mysterious, and maybe even a little saintly. Of course, the downside was blurry vision, light sensitivity, and the occasional unintended trip. But hey, beauty standards have never been particularly forgiving. Settling into deeper peace now, let history's gentle current carry you. Cosmetics aside, belladonna had other talents. It was used as a painkiller, a sleep aid, and occasionally as a truth serum, though the truth it produced was often along the lines of the ceiling is dripping Latin prayers. The plant contains atropine and scopolamine, both of which mess with the nervous system in ways that range from mildly trippy to why is the wallpaper vibrating. It was a common ingredient in potions, flying ointments, and some very questionable medical procedures. Want to numb a patient before sawing off a limb, belladonna? Want to simulate a death like sleep for theatrical or suspicious purposes, belladonna? Want to accidentally meet a few saints and possibly the devil in your dreams? You get the idea. And yet, despite its toxicity, belladonna was part of the medieval medical toolkit. Physicians used it carefully or recklessly, depending on how bad the plague was that week. And it shows up in herbals, recipes, and love charms across Europe. Tonight, as you drift toward the deepest sleep, carry with you the knowledge that medieval people were just as curious, just as foolish, and just as determined to alter their consciousness as we are today. They just had to work a lot harder for it and risk a lot more. The gentle rhythm of ancient waters carries you into dreams where strange herbs grow and stranger stories unfold. Before modern edibles came in discreet packaging and fruity flavors, medieval folks were already getting inventive, just not with chocolate. Instead, they relied on ointments, balms, tinctures, and potions. And let's be clear, the word ointment rarely inspires confidence, especially when it contains ingredients like belladonna, fat from a black cat, and a questionable amount of hemlock stirred counterclockwise under a full moon. Welcome to the world of medieval transdermal delivery systems, or in plain English, rubbing weird paste on your skin and hoping for the best. These concoctions weren't made for a casual weekend buzz. Many were tied to rituals, folk medicine, and spiritual experiences. They could knock you out, send you into ecstatic trances, or if misused, cause you to believe you were turning into a lizard. Application was often topical, which sounds safer until you learn the preferred absorption points were the mucous membranes. Yes, those membranes. Cue the infamous flying ointments associated with witches. A lovely blend of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and peak fat, often applied to, let's just say, intimate areas. The goal, a euphoric sensation of flying. The result, either a transcendent astral journey or waking up in a haystack with half your teeth and no memory of how you got there. Your muscles sink deeper into relaxation as you think about these strange methods. Beyond the salves, medieval potions were often consumed in wine, broth, or some liquid that smelled like regret. Apothecaries loved mixing poppy extract with spiced wine, a combo strong enough to numb you during surgery or give you a front row seat to a divine revelation you didn't ask for. And let's not forget the elixirs sold by wandering quacks. These traveling pharmacists promised to cure everything from heartbreak to plague, often using recipes that could also dissolve a shoe. Did they work? Maybe. Or maybe they just made you forget what was wrong in the first place. The magic of these medieval edibles was that no one could quite predict the outcome. Would you sleep peacefully, commune with angels, or scream at the moon and swear eternal loyalty to a turnip? Only one way to find out. Settling deeper into comfort now, as ancient recipes whisper through time. Let's talk about the broomstick, that iconic airborne companion of the medieval witch. It might seem quaint now, the stuff of fairy tales and Halloween costumes. But back then, it came with an awkwardly scandalous backstory. Spoiler, the broomstick wasn't just for sweeping. The connection between witches and broomsticks actually has chemical roots. And no, not just mandrake. Historical records, especially those written by suspicious inquisitors, describe witches using flying ointments. Thick, trance-inducing salves made from plants like henbane, belladonna, and datura, all of which are about as friendly as a drunk porcupine. But here's the kicker. These ointments weren't taken by mouth. Why? Because the ingredients were toxic, and stomachs are famously ungrateful. Instead, they were applied topically. And by topically, we mean mucous membranes. And by mucous membranes, We mean, yes, exactly what you're thinking. Hence the broomstick, or as some sources delicately phrased it, a staff anointed for transportation. The handle was used as a vehicle for applying the ointment to areas with high absorption. Not exactly PG, but highly effective. Within minutes, users reported visions of flying through the night sky, attending feasts with the devil, or simply hovering above the village like the world's most confused drone. Of course, these were hallucinations, but in an age where medicine, magic, and mysticism shared a bunk bed, no one questioned it much. Your breathing becomes barely perceptible now, so slow and peaceful. Inquisitors and theologians took note, of course, not because they were interested in pharmacology, but because they saw flying as evidence of consorting with demons, which is ironic considering the hallucinations were chemically induced and deeply unreliable. But when has medieval justice ever needed evidence while medieval Europe was busy applying poison to broomsticks and calling it air travel? Something far more sophisticated was happening to the south and east. In the flourishing cities of the Islamic Golden Age, enter hashish, the plant-based answer to existential dread and camel traffic. Derived from cannabis, resin, hashish was widely used in regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant, and unlike Europe's rub this on your elbow and meet Satan approach, Islamic scholars, mystics, and physicians actually documented its effects with a level of detail that suggests field testing. Hashish was often consumed orally, usually mixed with honey, spices, or other herbs, making it the first edible to actually taste good. As opposed to medieval Europe's tradition of bitter teas and things that smelled like spoiled socks, its use wasn't just recreational. Though, yes, that absolutely happened. Hashish was often tied to Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, where practitioners sought spiritual union with the divine. Hashish was believed to help dissolve the ego, clear the mind, and initiate deep contemplation, or, at the very least, encourage long, thoughtful stares at walls, drifting now on gentle currents of history. In fact, many Sufi poets and philosophers spoke of hashish the way modern songwriters speak about bad breakups, with intense emotion, abstract metaphors, and just enough fog to make you wonder if they were okay. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Many Islamic rulers tried to ban hashish use periodically, fearing it led to laziness, morale, decay, or people giggling too much during prayer. But like most substance bans in history, this had roughly the same success rate as teaching a cat to juggle. The legendary Hashashin, the original assassins, were even said to have used hashish before missions to get into the proper mindset for stabbing. That claim's mostly myth, but it's a great example of how cannabis-based products were already wrapped in both mystique and suspicion. Meanwhile, Europe was centuries away from understanding how to use cannabis without immediately setting something on fire or calling it devil grass. When you picture a medieval church, you might imagine stained glass, flickering candles, solemn chanting, and that thick, almost otherworldly cloud of incense wafting through the air like God's personal fog machine. But incense wasn't just about holiness. It also had a little something extra, psychoactive potential. Let's start with the two heavy hitters, frankincense and myrrh. Both resinous substances imported from the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. Burned in churches, temples, and royal courts. They were meant to cleanse the air, ward off evil spirits, and make everything smell slightly less like unwashed wool and fish stew. Your mind floats peacefully on ancient wisdom's gentle tide. But here's the twist. Modern studies have shown that burning frankincense releases compounds, particularly insensyl acetate, that can affect the brain's limbic system. Translation: if you sat in enough smoke, Gregorian chant wasn't the only thing making your head feel floaty. In poorly ventilated medieval chapels, which is to say all of them, prolonged exposure to incense could cause a mild tranquilizing effect, especially if paired with fasting, dehydration, or extreme boredom. It wasn't uncommon for monks or devotees to report visions during long services. And while they often credited divine inspiration, it's possible some were just lightly buzzed from resin fumes. And if you think this was limited to Christian spaces, think again. Incense was a common fixture in mosques, synagogue, Buddhist temples, and even pre-Christian pagan rites. It transcended religion. Everyone loves a good vibe. Apparently, clerics insisted the incense helped lift the soul to heaven. Realistically, it may have just softened the edges of reality enough to make 5-hour sermons a bit more tolerable. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of putting on lofi beats and lighting a scented candle, but with more Latin and less chill, settling into profound peace as history's lessons gently embrace you. If there was one thing medieval people could count on, besides taxis and the occasional plague, it was alcohol, beer, al, mead, wine, cider, you name it. Someone was brewing it in a wooden barrel behind their house and calling it medicine. And in a way, water wasn't exactly safe to drink. Most natural sources were either contaminated or casually downstream from livestock, which meant sipping from a stream was basically playing intestinal roulette. So instead, people reached for something a little more fermented. Enter small beer, the medieval version of La Croix, but with alcohol and a much higher chance of being brewed by someone named Edith, who measured ingredients by intuition and prayer. This low alcohol drink was consumed daily by adults and children alike, not to get drunk, but to stay alive with a light buzz and regular hydration. Of course, not all medieval alcohol was so tame. If you were wealthier or simply had fewer plans for the day, you might opt for stronger ale, honey mead, or imported wine. And yes, wine was often mixed with herbs or spices, either for flavor, medicinal effect, or just to see what happened. In monasteries, brewing beer was practically a sacred duty. Monks perfected recipes, documented fermentation methods, and taste tested the results, often with great enthusiasm. If salvation came in pints, the Benedictines were well ahead of the curve. But alcohol wasn't just a drink. It was a lifestyle enhancer. Want to dull the pain of medieval dentistry, ale. Want to treat melancholy, spiced wine. Want to forget you live in a drafty hovel with 6 other people and one extremely judgmental chicken mead. Your breathing is so slow now, so peaceful, carrying you toward deepest rest. Taverns, inns, and roadside ale houses served as medieval therapy offices, only with more yelling. People drank to celebrate, mourn, gossip, and occasionally invent entirely new dance styles no one asked for. Sometimes getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't a decision. It was just breakfast. Enter ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains to the untrained medieval eye. It looked like a slightly weird, blackened kernel. To the modern scientist, it's a biological prank with side effects that read like a medieval curse. Convulsions, hallucination, burning limbs, and occasionally the sensation that your hands have turned into spiders. This fungus was the accidental ingredient in what some historians call the original LSD trip. Centuries before the Summer of Love, Woodstock, or anything with tie-dye, people in parts of Europe, especially in colder, damp regions like France and the Germanic territories, frequently baked bread from infected rye. Why? Because hunger trumps fungus awareness. And so entire villages would unknowingly ingest ergot-laced loaves. And the results were both spectacular and horrifying. There were two forms of ergotism. Yes, it had a name, convulsive ergotism, characterized by muscle spasms, seizures, hallucination, and fits of laughter or panic, gangrenous ergotism, where blood flow was cut off, leading to limbs blackening, shriveling and falling off, not ideal for dinner parties. Tonight, let these echoes of medieval experimentation carry you into the most peaceful sleep, where ancient herbs no longer threaten, where knowledge replaces fear, where the gentle rhythm of history rocks you safely into dreams of simpler times and stranger remedies. Local outbreaks led to bizarre public behavior, including dancing plagues, where groups of people danced uncontrollably for days, sometimes until death. At the time, it was blamed on demons, divine punishment, or moral weakness, but in reality, it may have just been a mass case of unintentional mushroom toast. Ironically, the Order of St. Anthony, which ran hospitals for the afflicted, helped treat victims of ergotism, often by feeding them wheat-based diets instead of rye. So yes, the cure was different bread. Did people connect the dots? Not really. To a medieval baker, bread was either fine or definitely possessed, and no one was testing for psychoactive alkaloids in their porridge. They were too busy trying not to be excommunicated. Even today, some scholars believe ergot played a role in the Salem witch trials. Hallucination, fits, paranoia, all very ergoty, but that's still debated. What's not debated, medieval Europe got high on toast and didn't even know it. Your muscles release their final tension as you sink into profound peace. You've heard of magic mushrooms. You've heard of flying ointments. But have you ever heard of mad honey? Yes. In a few special corners of the medieval world, even the bees were in on it. This wasn't your average grocery store honey. Mind you, we're talking about a rare type produced in the mountainous Black Sea regions of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where bees feasted on rhododendron flowers, pretty pink blooms with a dark secret. They're laced with grey anotoxins, naturally occurring compounds that don't play nicely with the human nervous system. The result, mad honey, a substance so potent it could bring on dizziness, hallucination, vomiting, slowed heart rate, and spiritual visions, usually in that order. Consumed in small doses, it offered a mild buzz. In larger doses, it turned your day into a slow-motion opera starring your own eyebrows. This wasn't just a local curiosity. It was weaponized. According to ancient and medieval sources, invading armies were once deliberately poisoned with mad honey left behind in abandoned villages. Soldiers thought they'd scored free snacks. Instead, they ended up convulsing on the forest floor, realizing too late that baked goods are not to be trusted. Settling into the deepest rest now, as understanding washes over you, Greek and Roman authors like Xenophon and Strabo wrote about these effects centuries earlier. But the use persisted well into the Middle Ages. Locals knew how to handle the stuff. A little on bread for headache, a little in wine for visions, or none at all if you actually wanted to remember your own name by dusk. Mad honey became known as a remedy and a recreational substance, especially in mystical or folk healing traditions. Some users claimed it brought prophetic dreams, while others just woke up clutching a potato they believed was their uncle. Results varied, and yes, it was traded. Some ambitious merchants sold it in small ceramic jars, usually without dosage instructions, because who needs warning labels when you live in an era where leeches are considered sophisticated medicine? Not everyone in the Middle Ages was a priest. A noble, or plague-ridden peasant. Some folks operated in the shadowy margins of society as shamans, herbalists, conning folk, and other semi-legitimate practitioners of medicine and mischief. Think of them as medieval pharmacists with zero regulation and a deep personal relationship with moss. These were the people you visited when the local physician suggested bloodletting for your toothache. They had no degrees, but they had herbal knowledge passed down through generations, often learned by watching Grandma treat boils with bark and dignity. And when it came to mind-altering substances, these folks were your go-to. They knew which plants to grind into paste, which roots to soak in wine, and how much of a given herb would make you dream of angels instead of accidentally join them. Your breathing becomes slower and more rhythmic as knowledge flows through time. Whether you were looking to relieve pain, induce visions, curse your neighbor, or have an out-of-body experience during laundry, they had a remedy or three. Many of these practitioners were women, midwives, wise women, and healers who were essential to their communities and deeply feared by authority figures, not because they were cackling into cauldrons, but because they knew too much and didn't need Latin to explain it. Their remedies often included henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and poppy derivatives. They'd mix them with wine, fat, honey, or spit. Not kidding. Chant a few protective phrases and send you on your way with something that could either heal you or make you passionately confess to crimes you never committed. Of course, if anything went wrong, say a hallucination involving flying goats or the sudden urge to marry a tree, blame shifted quickly from bad batch to witchcraft. The church and local authorities kept one eye on these folk and the other eye nervously twitching. Still, communities relied on them. When your child had a fever, when your joints ached, or when you needed to contact a dead relative to ask where they hid the rent money, these were the people you turned to, drifting deeper now into restful contemplation of ancient wisdom. They weren't doctors. They weren't priests. They were the original underground wellness influencers. So after all the salves, brews, roots, ointments, insults, beers, and questionable bread, one big question remains. How did medieval people actually feel about getting high? The answer conflicted, deeply, hilariously conflicted. For some, especially healers and herbalists. Mind-altering substances were a practical tool. If it dulled pain, slowed a fevered mind, or made childbirth 1% less horrifying, it was welcomed. This was medicine, not mischief. Sure, the patient might start reciting psalms backward or insisting the cat was speaking French. But if the swelling went down, success. Then there were the spiritual users, monks, mystics, and those dabbling in divine communication. For them, hallucinations weren't red flags. They were revelations. Visions were signs of sanctity, not symptoms. If you stared into the void, and the void whispered back in Latin, you were on the fast track to sainthood, or at the very least, getting your own chapel mural. But intent mattered. Getting high by accident, fine. Getting high to see Jesus, acceptable. Getting high to flirt with a goat demon, now we have a problem. Your mind floats on gentle currents of ancient understanding. That's where the church stepped in, branding certain substances and their users as suspicious at best, heretical at worst. Anything associated with loss of control, be it intoxication, trance, or inconvenient honesty, raised clerical eyebrows. Saints could have visions, peasants probably just possessed. Meanwhile, among the common folk, opinions were more relaxed. Your neighbor's sleeping potion may have doubled as a psychedelic nightcap. People used poppy wine for pain, hashish for calm, henbane tea for dealing with the in-laws. It wasn't seen as mystical or rebellious. It was just part of the medicine chest, right next to the garlic and prayers. Ultimately, how the high was viewed came down to who you were, what you were using, and whether anyone tattled. In the medieval mind, altered states lived in a weird grey area between miracle and misdemeanor, health and heresy, and in a world where demons, saints, plagues, and turnip famines all walked hand in hand. A little herbal escape now and then, hardly the worst idea, settling into profound peace. You can appreciate the complexity. The medieval approach to intoxication wasn't simple. It was layered with religion, medicine, folklore, and fear. They didn't have our understanding of chemistry or neuroscience, but they had curiosity, they had desperation, and they had plants. Tonight, as you drift toward the deepest sleep, let yourself appreciate that humans have always sought to alter their consciousness, to escape pain, to find meaning, to simply make the unbearable more bearable. The Middle Ages were no different. They just had to work with what nature provided. And sometimes nature provided some very strange gifts indeed. The gentle whisper of history carries you now into dreams where ancient gardens grow, where monks tend mysterious herbs, where the line between medicine and magic blurs into mist, and where you rest peacefully. Grateful for modern pharmacology and child-proof caps, as we continue our peaceful journey through medieval consciousness alteration. Let's pause to appreciate the sheer creativity involved. These weren't people with chemistry labs or clinical trials. They were experimenting in the most literal sense, trying things, watching what happened, and either writing it down or dying trying. The trial and error approach to medieval pharmacology was both impressive and terrifying. Imagine being the first person to think, I wonder what happens if I boil this nightshade in wine and drink it while standing on one leg during a full moon. Either you discovered a cure for insomnia, or you became a cautionary tale told around winter fires for the next 300 years. Your breathing becomes slower and more peaceful as you settle deeper. The herbals, those medieval pharmaceutical textbooks, offer fascinating glimpses into this world of botanical experimentation. Monks and physicians would meticulously record which plants caused what effect, though their descriptions were sometimes creative. This root causeth great mirth and dancing, followed by the speaking of nonsense and the seeing of small dragons. That's not a direct quote, but it's not far off either. What's remarkable is how much they got right. Despite lacking modern scientific methods, medieval herbalists correctly identified many plants with genuine medicinal properties. Willow, bark for pain, which contains the compound we now use to make aspirin. Foxglove for heart conditions. Still used today in carefully measured doses as digitalis. Poppy for severe pain, the basis of modern opioids. They didn't understand why these plants worked, but they understood that they did. And they weren't afraid to experiment, sometimes recklessly, to find out what else was possible. The culture of experimentation extended beyond professional healers too. Regular people, farmers and craftspeople, would share knowledge about plants and their effects. The shepherd might discover that certain mushrooms made the sheep act strangely and wonder what they'd do to humans. A farmer's wife might notice that bread made from a particular batch of grain gave everyone vivid dreams. This grassroots pharmacology, passed through oral tradition and careful observation, formed the backbone of medieval folk medicine. Settling into deeper rest now, you can appreciate their courage. Of course, not all experimentation was benign. The same curiosity that led to medical breakthroughs also led to poisonings, both accidental and intentional. The line between healing dose and lethal dose was often discovered through tragic trial and error. Belladonna could save a life or end one, depending on who prepared it and how much they used. This made the herbalist's role incredibly important and equally dangerous. Get it right, and you're a valued community member. Get it wrong, and you might be accused of witchcraft, incompetence, or both. The religious dimension added another layer of complexity to medieval drug use. The church had complicated feelings about substances that altered consciousness. On one hand, religious ecstasy was celebrated. Saints had visions. Mystics experienced divine union. Holy people entered trances during prayer. These altered states were considered proof of God's favor, signs that the divine was reaching down to touch the mortal mind. But here's where it got tricky. How do you tell the difference between a vision from God and a hallucination from bad bread? The church's answer was essentially context matters. If you were a nun who'd been fasting and praying for days, and you saw an angel, that was legitimate religious experience. If you were a peasant who'd been chewing henbane and claimed to see the same angel, that was probably demonic deception. Entente, social status, and religious authority all played roles in determining whether your altered state was holy or heretical. Drifting now on the eternal current toward perfect rest. This double standard extended to other forms of intoxication too. Wine was central to Christian ritual, representing the blood of Christ in communion. Monks brewed beer and consumed it regularly. But drunkenness was condemned as sinful, showing lack of self-control and opening oneself to demonic influence. The substance itself wasn't necessarily the problem. It was how you used it and who you were when you did. The wealthy could indulge in spiced wines and imported delicacies with psychoactive properties. The poor drinking too much cheap ale were degenerates. Saints having visions were blessed. Peasants having the same experiences were suspect. Medieval society, like all societies, had one set of rules for the elite and another for everyone else. Gender also played a significant role in how drug use was perceived and punished. Women, especially those who worked with herbs and healing, we faced unique dangers. The same knowledge that made them valuable midwives and healers could get them accused of witchcraft if anything went wrong, or if they made powerful people uncomfortable. The famous flying ointments, those mixtures of psychoactive plants that supposedly allowed witches to fly to their Sabbaths, were very real substances with very real effects. But the experiences they produced, hallucinations of flight and gatherings with supernatural beings, were interpreted through the lens of contemporary fears about witchcraft and female power. A woman who knew how to make you see visions, feel no pain, or sleep through surgery had power. And powerful women made medieval authorities nervous. Your muscles relax completely as ancient wisdom flows through the darkness. The persecution of witches, which intensified in the late medieval period and early modern era, was partly about controlling access to these powerful substances and the knowledge of how to use them. By demonizing the folk healers who possessed this knowledge, especially women, authorities could assert control over both medical practice and female autonomy. It's no coincidence that many accused witches were older women, often widows, who lived alone and practiced traditional medicine. They represented a kind of independence and expertise that threatened patriarchal and institutional authority. Let's not forget the economic dimension of medieval drug use either. Many of the most sought-after substances, especially spices and resins used in medicine and ritual, came from far away. Frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, opium from the Middle East, exotic herbs from Asia. These weren't just medical supplies. They were luxury goods that moved along trade routes, generating wealth and power for those who controlled their distribution. The spice trade that connected Europe with Asia wasn't just about making food taste better. Many spices had medicinal or psychoactive properties. Nutmeg, for instance, which in large doses can cause hallucinations and delirium, was worth more than gold by weight in medieval Europe. A man with a sack of nutmeg could make his fortune. Wars were fought. Empires rose and fell, all driven partly by the desire to control access to these consciousness-altering substances, settling into the deepest peace as understanding embraces you. The same global trade networks that brought silk and spices to Europe also brought knowledge. Arabic medical texts, building on Greek and Roman learning, were translated into Latin and studied in medieval universities. Islamic scholars had preserved and expanded upon ancient pharmaceutical knowledge during Europe's early medieval period. When this learning flowed back to Europe, it revolutionized medical practice. Suddenly, European physicians had access to sophisticated theories about how different substances affected the body, detailed descriptions of hundreds of plants and their uses, and complex recipes for compounds that combined multiple ingredients for specific effects. The medieval university-trained physician might look down on the village herbalist, but they were often working with the same plants, just with fancier terminology and theoretical justifications. The intellectual exchange between Islamic and Christian medical traditions enriched both. Even as religious and political conflicts divided the Mediterranean world, scholars continued to share knowledge about healing and pharmacology. A Muslim physician in Baghdad and a Christian physician in Paris might be enemies in theory, but they were reading the same texts about opium, discussing the same theories about how henbane worked, and treating patients with similar remedies. Science and medicine have always had a way of crossing borders that politics cannot. Tonight, let these threads of connection carry you deeper into rest. The medieval period also saw the beginning of what we might call drug regulation, though it looked very different from modern laws. Guilds of physicians and apothecaries began to establish standards for who could practice medicine and how substances should be prepared and sold. This was partly about ensuring quality and safety. A properly trained apothecary was less likely to accidentally poison you than a random person selling herbs at market. But it was also about controlling a lucrative trade and establishing professional monopolies. The more formal medicine became, the more it pushed informal practitioners, especially women, to the margins. Medical schools, which began appearing in medieval Europe, taught according to classical texts and university curricula. They had little room for folk knowledge or practical experience gained outside academic settings. This created a split between learned medicine, practiced by university-educated male physicians, and Volksmedizin, practiced by healers of all genders who learned through apprenticeship and tradition. Both had their place, and both made use of consciousness-altering substances. But the two traditions increasingly viewed each other with suspicion and sometimes hostility. As you drift toward dreams, consider the continuity. We're still having these same debates today. Questions about who has the right to use which substances, what purposes justify altering consciousness, how we balance individual freedom with public safety, what role traditional knowledge should play versus scientific research. Medieval people grappled with all of these issues. Even if they framed them differently, they didn't have our vocabulary of addiction, neurochemistry, or public health, but they understood that some plants could heal or harm, that some people used substances wisely while others did not, and that society needed some way to manage these powerful tools. The medieval approach to drugs, combining medicine, magic, religion, and law, might seem strange to us, but in its own context, it made sense. It was an attempt to navigate the reality that nature provides substances that profoundly affect human consciousness, and humans will always seek them out, for better or worse. The challenge then, as now, was finding ways to minimize harm while respecting human needs and autonomy. Medieval people didn't always get the balance right. Neither do we. But we're all part of the same long conversation about what it means to be human in a world full of powerful plants. Good night. Gentle traveler, rest now in the knowledge that you're part of this ongoing story, that the questions medieval people asked about consciousness, healing, pleasure, and risk are still our questions, that we're still learning, still experimenting, still trying to understand these strange gifts nature has given us. Sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful, natural, and requiring no questionable ointments whatsoever. As we continue drifting through the hazy, herb-scented corridors of medieval consciousness, let's explore some of the more unexpected places where intoxication intersected with daily life. because getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't always a deliberate choice or a mystical quest. Sometimes it was just Tuesday. Your breathing slows naturally as you settle into this next chapter of our journey. Consider the medieval marketplace, that bustling center of commerce and gossip. Among the vegetables and cloth, you'd find stalls selling all manner of herbs and remedies, but quality control was, shall we say, inconsistent at best. The dried leaf you thought was mint might be something considerably more potent. The powder sold as a headache cure might contain enough belladonna to make you see things that weren't there. Caveat emptor took on a whole new meaning when your purchase might cause hallucinations. Street vendors, unlike guild-regulated apothecaries, operated with minimal oversight. They'd sell whatever they could gather or grow, making bold claims about effectiveness that ranged from optimistic to completely fictional. Want to cure boredness? This root will do it. Want to attract a lover? This powder is guaranteed. Want to commune with the dead? Well, this mixture might not achieve that exactly, but you'll certainly have an interesting evening. The desperation of illness and the hope for miracle cures made medieval people vulnerable to all sorts of dubious remedies. And when those remedies contained psychoactive substances, the results could be unpredictable. You might go to market for a simple stomach remedy and end up having what we'd now recognize as a moderate drug experience. Then there were the professional poisoners, a career path that fortunately hasn't survived into modern times. These individuals, often working for wealthy patrons, had extensive knowledge of toxic and psychoactive substances. They needed to know not just what would kill, but what would incapacitate, confuse, or alter behavior in specific ways, settling deeper into comfort now. Let your mind drift with the story. A rival needed to be eliminated, poison in their wine. But what if you wanted them to appear mad, to discredit them publicly before their death? That required a more subtle approach, a careful dosing with substances that would cause paranoia, hallucination, and erratic behavior. The poisoner's art was dark, but it demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how different substances affected the mind and body. These weren't random experiments. They were calculated uses of pharmacological knowledge for political and personal ends. The fact that such specialists existed and found employment tells us something important about medieval society. Power was precarious, and those who held it were always looking for edges, for ways to eliminate threats or gain advantages. Mind-altering substances were tools in these games of power, just as they've been throughout human history. Of course, the existence of skilled poisoners also fueled paranoia among the elite. Was that bitter taste in your wine just poor vintage? Or was someone trying to kill you? Was your sudden dizzy spell natural illness? Or had an enemy slipped something into your food? The wealthy employed food tasters, kept their own supplies under guard, and suspected everyone. Living at the top of medieval society meant living with constant fear of what might be in your next meal. Meanwhile, in monasteries and convents, a different kind of altered consciousness was being cultivated. Monastic life involved practices specifically designed to change normal mental states through fasting, sleep deprivation, repetitive prayer, and sensory restriction. Add to this the incense-filled chapels and the wine consumed during religious services, and you had an environment practically engineered to produce mystical experiences. Many monks and nuns reported visions, divine visitation, and states of religious ecstasy Were these purely spiritual experiences, or were they also influenced by the physiological effects of their lifestyle and environment? Your muscles release all tension as ancient wisdom washes over you. The line between the spiritual and the chemical isn't always clear, and perhaps it doesn't need to be. Medieval religious practitioners didn't think in terms of brain chemistry or altered neurotransmitters. For them, fasting and prayer opened the soul to divine communication. If those practices also created physiological states that made unusual mental experiences more likely, that didn't diminish their spiritual significance. In fact, the physical preparation was seen as necessary for spiritual receptivity. Saint Teresa of Avila, writing in the 16th century but reflecting earlier medieval traditions, described ecstatic visions in language that sounds remarkably like descriptions of intense, altered states. She spoke of the soul being lifted out of the body, of experiencing divine love, so intense it was almost painful, of visions so vivid they seemed more real than ordinary reality. Were her experiences purely divine, or did her extreme ascetic practices, which included severe fasting and self-flagellation, create physiological conditions that facilitated these states? Medieval believers wouldn't have separated the two. The physical and spiritual were intertwined, both necessary parts of the path to divine union. Let's talk about medieval surgery, a topic that naturally brings us to pain management. Before modern anesthesia, surgery was an agonizing ordeal. The surgeon needed to work as quickly as possible while the patient screamed and struggled. This is where substances like opium, mandroke, and henbane became literally life-saving. A mixture called duale, which combined these and other ingredients in wine, could render a patient unconscious or at least significantly reduce their awareness of pain. The recipe varied, but the goal was always the same: get the patient through the procedure without dying from shock or pain. The effectiveness varied too. Sometimes the patient slept through surgery peacefully. Sometimes they remained partially conscious, experiencing the pain as if from a distance, disconnected from their body. And sometimes, despite the duale, they felt everything, their screams echoing through the surgeon's workshop. Medieval surgery was brutal, desperate work, and the drugs available, while helpful, were crude and inconsistent, drifting now toward the deepest rest, carried by currents of understanding. Barber surgeons, who combined haircutting with bloodletting and minor surgery, kept supplies of these medicines. They had to, because their work involved a lot of pain. Pulling teeth, lancing boils, setting broken bones, cutting for bladder stones, all of this required either restraining the patient or dosing them with something strong. The barber surgeon who could reliably knock patients out had a significant competitive advantage. People would travel to see the surgeon who could promise less suffering, even if the surgery itself was no more skillful. This created incentives for these practitioners to develop their pharmacological knowledge, to experiment with different combinations and doses to find what worked best. Some became quite expert, developing reputations as much for their drugs as for their surgical skill. But the same substances used for mercy could also be used for other purposes. A surgeon might keep opium on hand for post-operative pain relief, selling doses to those suffering from chronic pain or other ailments. The line between medical use and recreational use was blurry. If the substance helped people cope with pain or difficulty, did it matter whether that pain was physical or emotional? Medieval medicine didn't draw sharp distinctions between physical and mental suffering. Treating both with whatever tools were available, think about the medieval understanding of melancholy, what we might now call depression. This was considered a serious medical condition, often treated with substances meant to lift the spirits. Wine mixed with herbs, opium in small doses, various tonics and remedies, all aimed at restoring balance to the patient's humors. Modern antidepressants work on brain chemistry. Medieval remedies did too, though without that understanding, they found through trial and error that certain substances could alter mood and emotional state. That this knowledge was wrapped in theories about humors and spiritual influences doesn't change the practical reality that they were treating mental health conditions with psychoactive drugs. Your breathing becomes barely perceptible now, so peaceful and slow. The concept of self-medication was alive and well in the Middle Ages. If you knew that poppy tea helped with your chronic pain, you'd make poppy tea. If henbane helped you sleep, you'd find ways to get henbane. If alcohol numbed your emotional distress, you'd drink. The same human impulses that drive substance use today existed then. People in pain, physical or emotional, seeking relief through whatever means available. The difference was that medieval people had fewer options and less understanding of risks. No one was tracking addiction rates or studying long-term effects. People learned through observation that some who used these substances heavily became dependent on them, unable to function without their regular dose. They noticed that some substances, particularly opium, created powerful cravings, but they didn't have frameworks for understanding addiction as we do now. It was seen as a moral failing, a lack of self-control, rather than a medical condition requiring treatment. This meant that people struggling with dependence on substances faced shame and judgment rather than help. They were weak-willed, sinful, unable to master their base appetites. The idea that addiction might be a disease, that brain chemistry might be altered by repeated substance use, that some people might be more vulnerable than others. None of this was available to medieval thinking. So people suffered in silence or faced social condemnation, even as they desperately sought the substances their bodies now demanded. Let's consider the role of alcohol more carefully, as it deserves special attention. Alcohol was the most widely used mind-altering substance in medieval Europe, consumed in quantities that would shock modern sensibilities. The average person, including children, drank several liters of small beer daily. Stronger drinks were common at meals, celebrations, and social gatherings. Alcohol wasn't just tolerated, it was central to social life, religious practice, and economic activity. Entire regions depended on brewing and winemaking for their prosperity. But this universal acceptance didn't mean alcohol was unproblematic. Drunkenness was common and caused all the issues it causes now: violence, accidents, neglect of responsibilities, family strife. Moralists condemned it. Laws attempted to regulate it. Churches preached against it. And still, people drank, because alcohol did what it's always done: it lowered inhibitions, eased social interactions, temporarily relieved suffering, and made difficult lives more bearable, settling into the final depths of peace as ancient stories draw to a close. The medieval alehouse or tavern was a democratic space in a rigidly hierarchical society. Rich and poor might drink together. Social barriers temporarily lowered by ale. Songs were sung, stories told, deals made, conspiracies hatched. These were the social centers of medieval communities, serving functions that went far beyond just selling drinks. They were news exchanges, employment offices, community centers, and yes, places where people regularly got drunk. Tavern keepers wielded significant informal power as the hosts of these gathering spaces. They heard everything, knew everyone's business, and often served as informal mediators in disputes. The alcohol they served loosened tongues and revealed secrets. A smart tavern keeper learned much about their community, making them valuable sources of information for those in power. This also made them potentially dangerous, knowing too much about too many people. The regulation of taverns and alehouses was constant concern for medieval authorities. Too many drinking establishments meant too many places where people could gather unsupervised, where seditious talk might flourish, where disorder might start. But closing them down entirely was impossible. People would drink regardless, and better to have it happen in licensed establishments where it could at least be monitored. So authorities tried to control alcohol through licensing, taxation, and rules about serving hours and who could be served. These efforts had limited success, as prohibition and regulation attempts usually do. Now, as we near the end of this part of our journey, let's reflect on what all this tells us about medieval people and about humans in general. The medieval approach to consciousness-altering substances was simultaneously more permissive and more restrictive than ours. More permissive in that many substances were freely available, used widely, and integrated into daily life. More restrictive in that the church and social norms heavily policed how and why these substances were used, with harsh consequences for those deemed to be using them wrongly. Medieval people didn't understand pharmacology, neuroscience, or addiction as we do, but they understood human nature. They knew that people sought altered states for many reasons: to escape pain, to find meaning, to experience pleasure, to cope with difficulty. They developed elaborate systems, religious and social and legal, to try to channel these impulses in acceptable directions. These systems were imperfect, often hypocritical, sometimes cruel, but they represented genuine attempts to grapple with the reality that humans and mind-altering substances have always coexisted and always will. Tonight, as sleep approaches, remember that the medieval world was not so different from ours. Different substances, different understandings, different rules, but the same human needs, the same searches for relief and meaning, the same struggles to balance individual desires with social order. We are not so far removed from those people mixing herbs by candlelight, hoping for healing or vision or simply a few hours of peace. Their experiments, their mistakes, their discoveries, all part of the long human story of consciousness and its alteration. Rest now, knowing that history connects us across centuries, that the questions they faced are still our questions, that we're all trying to navigate the same fundamental challenges of being human in a world full of powerful substances and limited understanding. As we drift deeper into the night, let's explore one final fascinating aspect of medieval intoxication: the unexpected moments when entire communities shared altered states together, creating collective experiences that shaped culture and memory. These weren't planned parties or deliberate ceremonies. They were accidents of circumstance, environmental factors, and social conditions that led to groups experiencing consciousness changes simultaneously. Your breathing becomes slower. deeper, more peaceful with each moment. Consider the dancing plagues we mentioned earlier. Those bizarre outbreaks where hundreds of people would dance uncontrollably for days. The most famous occurred in Strasbourg in 1518. But similar events happened throughout medieval Europe. Ergot poisoning is one explanation. But the full picture is more complex. These episodes seem to spread through social contagion as well as chemical causes. One person would start dancing, then others would join, then more, until you had crowds dancing in the streets. Unable or unwilling to stop, some danced until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some died. The rest eventually stopped, often with no clear memory of why they'd started or what had compelled them to continue. These events terrified authorities, who saw them as evidence of demonic possession, divine punishment, or mass madness. Physicians were called in. Priests performed exorcisms. Magistrates tried to restore order, but often the dancing would simply have to run its course, burning itself out like a fever. Modern historians suggest these were complex events involving multiple factors: ergot contamination of food supplies, yes, but also mass hysteria fueled by stress and fear, religious fervor seeking expression, and social pressures in tightly constrained communities. The altered states were both chemical and psychological, individual and collective, creating experiences that defied simple explanation, settling into deeper comfort. You can almost hear the ancient drums. Similar collective experiences occurred during religious festivals and pilgrimages, when thousands gathered at holy sites, fasting and praying intensely, walking for days in all weather. The combination of physical stress, emotional intensity, and shared belief could create conditions for group altered states. Pilgrims reported seeing visions, experiencing healings, feeling overwhelming religious emotions. Were these purely spiritual experiences, or did the physiological effects of the pilgrimage, exhaustion, dehydration, possible food contamination, intense social pressure, create conditions that made unusual experiences more likely? Again, for medieval people, this distinction wouldn't have mattered. The physical preparation was part of the spiritual journey, and the resulting experiences, whatever their ultimate causes, were understood as encounters with the divine. Large crowds in confined spaces, whether churches, festival grounds, or city squares, created their own altered consciousness just through social dynamics. The press of bodies, the heat, the noise, the shared focus, all of this affects brain function and perception. Add incense smoke, rhythmic chanting or music, hours of standing or kneeling, and you have a recipe for altered states, even before considering any chemical substances. Medieval people understood this intuitively, if not scientifically. They designed religious ceremonies to be overwhelming, to transport participants out of ordinary consciousness into sacred experience. The architecture of great cathedrals, designed to make people feel small before God's majesty. The Gregorian chant echoing in stone spaces. The visual spectacle of processions and rituals, all calculated to shift perception, to create a sense of encountering something beyond the everyday. And it worked. People left these experiences changed, feeling they touched something transcendent. Whether you interpret that as genuine divine encounter or as skillful manipulation of psychology and brain chemistry, the experiential reality was powerful. Your muscles release completely as you sink into peaceful contemplation. Market days and fairs were another occasion for collective altered consciousness, though of a different kind. These gatherings brought together people from wide areas, creating temporary communities where normal social rules relaxed somewhat, and where alcohol and other substances flowed freely. Traveling entertainers, merchants, prostitutes, thieves, farmers, nobles, all mixing together in a carnival atmosphere. The excitement, the novelty, the loosening of daily constraints, the drinking it, all contributed to altered states that were social and psychological as much as chemical. People behaved at fairs in ways they wouldn't at home, embraced by the temporary nature of the gathering and the anonymity of crowds. These events served as pressure release valves for communities, allowing behaviors and experiences that were suppressed in everyday life. Authorities understood this and generally tolerated more during fairs than they would normally, recognizing that some letting loose prevented worse problems. But they also watched carefully, because the altered consciousness of crowds could turn dangerous. Riots could start easily in these heightened emotional states, spreading through crowds like wildfire. Let's talk about seasonal patterns of intoxication. Another fascinating aspect of medieval life. The agricultural calendar created rhythms of scarcity and abundance that affected substance use. After harvest, when food and drink were plentiful, people celebrated with feasting and drinking. Winter was a time of relative plenty immediately after harvest, then increasing scarcity as supplies dwindled. Spring was the hungry time, when last year's food was running out, but new crops hadn't come in yet. These patterns affected not just nutrition, but also access to substances. Ale was freshest and most abundant after harvest. Wine was ready at certain seasons. Even wild plants used for medicines or intoxication had their seasons. This created calendar rhythms in the kinds and intensities of altered states people experienced. Drifting now into the gentlest sleep. History's rhythms rocking you softly. Harvest celebrations were particularly important occasions for sanctioned intoxication. After months of hard labor, communities would celebrate together with elaborate feasting and drinking. These weren't just parties. They were necessary social bonds strengthened, hierarchies temporarily relaxed. Hard work rewarded. The drinking at harvest festivals was expected, even encouraged. It was when the Lord would provide ale for workers, when social superiors and inferiors would drink together, when the normal rules softened. These festivals served important social functions, releasing tensions built up over the working season and reaffirming community bonds. The intoxication was part of that, lowering barriers between people who normally maintained strict social distances. Of course, this also meant that violence and other problems were common at these events. Put hundreds of people together, add alcohol and other substances, relax normal constraints, and conflicts will emerge. Medieval court records are full of cases stemming from harvest celebrations gone wrong, fights, accidents, sexual assaults, property damage, all spike around these festivals. Authorities tried to manage this with regulations and oversight. With mixed success, winter brought its own patterns. In Northern Europe, where winter meant long, dark nights and confinement indoors, different substances became important. Alcohol consumption remained high, perhaps increased, as people sought warmth and distraction from the cold and darkness. The Christmas season was a particularly important time for sanctioned excess, with 12 days of Christmas involving feasting and drinking on a scale that put stress on food supplies, but served important social and psychological function. Getting through winter in medieval Europe was challenging. The cold, the darkness, the confinement, the monotony all took psychological tolls. Alcohol and other substances helped people cope, providing pleasure and distraction in a difficult season. The Church condemned drunkenness as always, but also recognized that winter celebrations served important purposes. So the preaching against excess was often balanced with tolerance for seasonal festivities that involved considerable drinking. Spring brought different substances into play as plants began growing again. Fresh herbs became available, including some with psychoactive properties. This was also the season for bloodletting, that medieval cure-all. Many people would have themselves bled in spring, believing it necessary to balance their humours after winter. The resulting weakness and altered state was actually desired, seen as cleansing and rebalancing. Your breathing is barely perceptible now, so slow and gentle. Summer, depending on the region, might bring its own substances. In Mediterranean areas, this was when certain plants bloomed that were gathered for medicine and other uses. In northern areas, summer was a time of intensive agricultural labor, which meant less time and energy for pursuing altered states, but also more need for pain relief and medicines to keep workers functional. Injuries were common in agricultural work, and the substances used to manage pain were the same ones that could alter consciousness. A farm worker with a badly injured back might use opium or other painkillers that also affected their mental state. These seasonal and agricultural patterns remind us that medieval life was deeply connected to natural cycles in ways modern life often isn't. The substances available, the time and energy people had to use them, the social occasions that sanctioned their use all followed the rhythm of seasons and agricultural work. This created a very different relationship to intoxication than what we experience now, where most substances are available year-round and use is largely disconnected from natural or agricultural cycles. Let's consider one more aspect before we conclude this section, the role of travel and trade in spreading knowledge about substances and their uses. Medieval Europe wasn't isolated. Pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, scholars, and others traveled widely, encountering different cultures and practices. These travelers brought back knowledge, including information about substances and how they were used in other places. The Crusades, despite their violence and religious intolerance, exposed Europeans to Islamic medical knowledge and to substances used in the Middle East. Cannabis, various opiates, different preparations of familiar plants. All this knowledge flowed back to Europe through returning crusaders and through trade contacts. This cross-cultural exchange enriched European pharmacology, adding new options to the existing repertoire. Settling into the final depths of peace now, embraced by understanding, Marco Polo's travels to China, whether accurately reported or not, sparked European fascination with Asian substances and medicines. Later medieval travelers brought back increasingly detailed accounts of how different cultures used plants and other substances. This comparative knowledge helped Europeans understand that their own practices weren't the only possibilities, that other cultures had developed different relationships with consciousness-altering substances. Merchant networks, particularly those connecting Europe with the Islamic world and Asia, served as knowledge conduits. A merchant dealing in spices might also learn about their medicinal uses. A trader in incense would understand its psychological effects. This information spread through merchant networks, mixing with local knowledge to create new combinations and uses. Universities, which began appearing in medieval Europe, became centers for collecting and systematizing this knowledge. Medical faculties studied texts from multiple traditions, trying to synthesize them into comprehensive understanding. Students learned about substances from across the known world, their uses and effects, dangers and benefits. Then they dispersed, taking this knowledge back to their home regions. This created increasingly sophisticated understanding of pharmacology, at least among the educated elite. Tonight, as you approach the threshold of dreams, appreciate this medieval world of exchange and experimentation, of knowledge flowing across borders despite political and religious barriers, of human curiosity driving exploration of consciousness and its possibilities. The medieval people we've journeyed with tonight weren't primitive or superstitious, at least not entirely. They were humans trying to understand and navigate their world with the tools and knowledge available to them. Their experiments with consciousness-altering substances were part of that larger project of making sense of existence, of finding meaning and relief in difficult lives. Rest now, knowing that their questions echo in our own time, that we too are experimenting, learning, trying to find balances between freedom and safety, between individual choice and social good, between the desire for altered states and the need for functional societies. We have more knowledge than medieval people did, but we don't have all the answers. We're still learning, still experimenting, still trying to understand these strange and powerful substances that nature provides. Sleep well, gentle traveler, secure in the understanding that connects us across centuries, that makes medieval herbalists and modern researchers part of the same long conversation about consciousness and its alteration. As we approach the final stages of our journey through medieval consciousness, let's reflect on what all these stories and substances tell us about the human condition itself. Because beneath all the historical details, the strange plants, and the unusual practices, we find something universal, the human drive to alter consciousness, to escape ordinary reality, to seek experiences beyond the everyday. This drive is as old as humanity itself and shows no signs of disappearing. Your entire body relaxes now into the deepest peace. Medieval people pursued altered states for the same reasons. People always have to escape pain, both physical and emotional, to find meaning in lives that often seemed brutal and arbitrary, to experience pleasure in a world with few pleasures, to connect with something greater than themselves, whether divine or simply communal, to explore the possibilities of their own minds. These motivations haven't changed. Only the substances and social contexts have evolved. Pain relief remains one of the most sympathetic reasons for using consciousness-altering substances. Medieval people lived with levels of chronic pain we can barely imagine. Dental problems with no good treatment, injuries that healed poorly, if at all, diseases causing constant discomfort. The substances we've discussed, opium, henbane, mandrake. Alcohol offered the only relief available. Modern pain management is vastly better, but we're still using substances derived from the same plants. Morphine from poppies, musciamine from henbane, family plants. The medieval herbalist who gave opium tea to someone dying in agony was practicing the same medicine of mercy we practice today, just with cruder tools. The desire to escape suffering drives much substance use. Then and now, when life is painful, the appeal of something that makes the pain stop, even temporarily, is overwhelming. Medieval peasants working back-breaking labor, nobles dealing with political stress, everyone facing the constant threat of disease and death, all had reasons to seek oblivion occasionally. That alcohol was cheap and widely available, while other substances were more restricted, meant that alcohol bore most of this burden. The village drunk, pitied and condemned, was often someone self-medicating untreated pain or trauma, settling deeper into restful understanding of human nature across time. The search for meaning and spiritual experience drove another major category of use. Humans seem hardwired to seek transcendent experiences, to feel connected to something larger than themselves. Religion channeled this drive, providing frameworks and practices for achieving altered states understood as encounters with the divine. But the same drive motivated use outside religious contexts. The person taking mandrake hoping for prophetic dreams. The mystic using hashish to dissolve ego boundaries. The monk using fasting and incense to achieve visions, all seeking meaning through altered consciousness. Modern society channels this drive differently through various spiritual practices, therapies, and yes, substance. But the underlying human need hasn't changed. We still seek experiences that take us beyond ordinary consciousness, that provide sense of connection and meaning. The forms change, but the drive remains constant. Social connection and pleasure seeking are equally powerful motivators. Humans are social animals who evolved to live in groups. Substances that facilitate social bonding, that lower inhibitions and make interactions easier, serve important functions. Alcohol's universal appeal relates partly to this. A few drinks make conversation flow more easily, make people more comfortable with each other, temporarily ease the anxieties that can make social interaction difficult. Medieval people understood this, gathering in alehouses and at festivals to drink together, using alcohol as social lubricant just as we do. The pleasure principle can't be ignored either. Altered states can feel good. The euphoria of hashish, the dreamy relaxation of opium, the cheerful disinhibition of alcohol, these are pleasurable experiences that humans naturally seek. Medieval people weren't immune to this. They enjoyed getting drunk, appreciated the pleasant effects of various herbs, sought experiences that felt good. Moralists condemned pleasure-seeking, especially when it interfered with duties or violated religious rules. But people pursued pleasure anyway because pleasure is fundamentally appealing. Your breathing becomes almost imperceptible now. Peaceful and slow, curiosity and exploration of consciousness itself motivated some use. The human mind is endlessly interesting to itself. What happens if I take this plant? How will it change my perceptions? What new experiences can I access? This curiosity, dangerous though it could be, drove experimentation and discovery. The herbalists and healers testing new substances, carefully observing effects, were engaged in a kind of primitive neuroscience. They were mapping the territories of consciousness through direct experience, documenting what they found for others to use. Modern psychonauts exploring consciousness through various substances continue this tradition of curiosity-driven exploration. We have better tools, better safety measures, more understanding. But the fundamental drive is the same: to explore the mind's possibilities, to understand consciousness by altering it. Medieval experimenters risked madness, death, and religious condemnation. Modern explorers face different risks, but are driven by similar curiosity. Now, what can we learn from medieval approaches to consciousness alteration that might inform our own practices and policies? First, the recognition that prohibition doesn't work. Medieval authorities tried repeatedly to control substance use through laws, religious sanctions, and social pressure. They had mixed success at best. People found ways to access what they wanted despite restrictions. The substances that were most successfully controlled were those that were naturally scarce or expensive, not those that were heavily prohibited. This suggests that availability rather than law is often the primary determinant of use patterns. Second, the importance of social context and cultural frameworks. Medieval people's experiences with substances were shaped by their understanding of what these experiences meant. Religious frameworks turned some altered states into divine encounters. Medical frameworks turned others into therapeutic interventions. Social contexts determined which uses were acceptable and which were condemned. Drifting into the gentlest rest now. Wisdom settling over you like a blanket. The same substance could be medicine, sacrament, or sin, depending on who used it. Why? And in what context? This reminds us that substances themselves aren't the whole story. How societies understand and frame substance use powerfully shapes outcomes. Third, the recognition that different purposes for use require different approaches. Medieval society, for all its contradictions, understood this implicitly. Pain relief was treated differently than pleasure-seeking. Religious uses were granted legitimacy that recreational uses weren't. Medical applications were governed by different rules than casual use. Modern drug policy often tries to treat all use the same way, but medieval experience suggests that's a mistake. Different motivations and contexts call for different regulatory approaches. Fourth, the acknowledgement that substance use is inevitable, and the question is how to minimize harm. Medieval societies never eliminated use. Instead, they developed various strategies for managing it, designating acceptable contexts like festivals and religious ceremonies, providing alternatives like socially sanctioned alcohol use, offering frameworks for understanding experiences, establishing norms about acceptable and unacceptable use. These strategies weren't always effective or fair, but they recognized a reality that some modern policies deny people will use mind-altering substances. The question isn't whether use will happen, but how to make it as safe as possible. Fifth, the importance of knowledge and education. The difference between helpful use and harmful use often came down to knowledge. The skilled herbalist who understood dosing could provide relief. The ignorant user could kill themselves or others. Medieval society recognized this by valuing expertise, even while being suspicious of it. Modern harm reduction approaches build on this insight, providing accurate information, teaching safe practices, making knowledge accessible rather than hoping ignorance will prevent use. Your muscles have completely released all tension now, floating in peaceful rest. Sixth, the recognition that social factors matter enormously. Medieval substance use patterns reflected social hierarchies, economic realities, and cultural values. The wealthy had access to different substances than the poor. Men's use was judged differently than women's. Religious authorities' uses were sanctioned, while folk healers were suspicious. These patterns remind us that substance policy is never just about substances. It's always also about power, inequality, and social control. Seventh, the understanding that human needs for relief, meaning, connection, and pleasure won't go away. Medieval people sought altered states because being human involves pain, question, loneliness, and desire for more than daily existence provides. These fundamental features of human life haven't changed. Any approach to substance use that ignores these underlying human needs is likely to fail. Finally, the value of humility. Medieval people didn't understand pharmacology, neuroscience, or addiction, but they were honest about the limits of their knowledge. They knew they didn't fully understand these powerful substances. They approached them with respect mixed with fear. Modern science has given us much more understanding, but we still don't know everything. Humility about the limits of our knowledge, willingness to acknowledge uncertainty, and respect for the power of consciousness-altering substances, these medieval attitudes remain valuable. As you drift now toward the edge of sleep, let these lessons settle gently in your mind. Medieval people were neither wiser nor more foolish than we are. They were humans like us, trying to navigate the same fundamental challenges with different tools and different knowledge. Their experiments, their mistakes, their discoveries all contribute to the long conversation humanity has been having with itself about consciousness and its alteration. We stand on their shoulders, benefit from their hard-won knowledge, learn from their errors. The herbs they mixed by candlelight led eventually to modern pharmaceuticals. The spiritual techniques they developed influenced contemporary mindfulness practices. The social policies they crafted, however imperfectly, inform our current debates. Medieval people weren't that long ago. Not really. Just 20 or 30 generations separate us from the world we've explored tonight. Their DNA is our DNA. Their brains functioned like ours. They felt pain and pleasure, fear and joy, curiosity and confusion, just as we do. The specific substances and social contexts differed, but the underlying human story remains the same. Tonight, as sleep embraces you, remember that you're part of this continuing story. The questions medieval people asked about consciousness, pleasure, relief, and meaning are still our questions. We're all trying to understand what it means to be human in a world that offers powerful ways to change our experience of being. We're all seeking balance between freedom and safety, individual desire and social good, the appeal of altered states and the need for clarity. Rest now, knowing that this conversation continues, that future generations will look back on our approaches to consciousness alteration with the same mixture of understanding and puzzlement that we bring to medieval practices. They'll see things we got right and things we got wrong. They'll learn from our experiments and our mistakes, just as we've learned from those who came before. The long human story of consciousness and its alteration continues, generation after generation, each adding its chapter to the ongoing narrative. Sleep well, gentle traveler, your place in this story secure, your consciousness ready to return to its ordinary state, enriched by this journey through time. As we reach the final stretch of our journey through medieval intoxication, let's bring all these threads together and consider what this strange, fascinating world ultimately teaches us about being human. The night deepens around you, and your breathing has become so slow, so peaceful. that you're barely aware of your body anymore, just consciousness floating, ready to embrace dreams. Medieval people weren't exotic, others whose experiences are foreign to us. They were humans facing human problems with human solutions. The substances they used, the reasons they used them, the problems and benefits that resulted, all remarkably familiar despite the centuries that separate us. This shouldn't surprise us. Human biology hasn't changed significantly in the past 1,000 years. The brain that responded to henbane in 1250 is essentially the same brain we have today. The psychological needs that drove medieval people to seek altered states are our psychological needs. We've changed our technologies, our social structures, our explicit beliefs, but the underlying human experience remains constant. The universality of substance use across cultures and throughout history tells us something important. This isn't aberrant behavior or modern decadence. It's a fundamental feature of human existence. Every culture we know of has discovered and used consciousness-altering substances. This suggests that the drive to alter consciousness is basic to who we are as a species, not something imposed by particular social conditions or cultural failures. Recognizing this doesn't mean endorsing all substance use or denying that it can be harmful. But it does suggest that approaches based on eliminating use entirely are fighting human nature itself. Your entire being settles into the deepest tranquility now. Medieval people's complex relationship with intoxication, accepting some forms while condemning others, mirrors our own ambivalence. We too live with contradictions: pharmaceutical drugs versus illegal drugs, alcohol versus cannabis, prescription versus recreation. We judge some consciousness alteration as medical and legitimate, other as dangerous and criminal. Often these distinctions reflect social power and cultural prejudice more than actual differences in safety or effect. The medieval world reminds us that these categories are cultural constructions, not natural facts. What counted as medicine versus sin, acceptable versus forbidden, depended on social context, not inherent properties of the substances themselves. This insight should make us more humble about our own categories and more willing to examine whether they serve justice or merely tradition. The role of expertise in navigating consciousness alteration hasn't changed. Medieval people recognized that knowledge mattered. The skilled herbalist provided benefit. The ignorant user caused harm. We recognize the same thing, though we've institutionalized expertise differently through medical schools, licensing, and professional organizations. But the fundamental insight remains. These are powerful tools that require knowledge to use safely. The medieval tension between folk knowledge and formal medicine continues today in debates about traditional medicines, self-medication, and who gets to determine what counts as legitimate expertise. Medieval folk healers, especially women, were marginalized and sometimes persecuted by male-dominated medical establishments. Today we see similar dynamics in how mainstream medicine sometimes dismisses traditional knowledge, how professional boundaries exclude certain practitioners, how power structures determine whose expertise is valued. Neither complete distrust of institutions nor uncritical acceptance of them serves us well. We need the rigor and resources of formal medicine. But we also need space for practices and knowledge that fall outside its boundaries. The medieval world, for all its injustices, sometimes achieved this balance better than we do, drifting now into the gentlest embrace of approaching sleep. The religious and spiritual dimensions of medieval substance use pose interesting questions for our more secular age. Medieval people often experienced altered states within religious frameworks that gave meaning and structure to the experience. The vision induced by fasting and prayer was understood as encountering the divine. Modern users often lack such frameworks, experiencing altered states without clear meaning or interpretation. Some argue this makes modern use more dangerous, without the guardrails that religious context provided. Others counter that those religious frameworks also caused harm, pathologizing experiences that didn't fit approved patterns. Perhaps what we can learn is not to return to medieval religious frameworks, but to recognize that consciousness alteration needs meaning-making structures, whether religious, therapeutic, communal, or personal. Frameworks that help interpret and integrate unusual experiences seem valuable. People need ways to understand what happens to them when consciousness shifts. Without such frameworks, powerful experiences can be confusing or even traumatic. The communal aspects of medieval intoxication also deserve consideration. Much use happened in social contexts, religious ceremonies, festivals, shared meals, communal work. The social embedding provided both safety and meaning. People weren't isolated users, but members of communities with shared understandings and mutual support. Modern substance use is often more isolated, more private. This has benefits in terms of freedom and personal choice, but it may also increase risks, removing the social context that can moderate use and provide support when problems arise. The medieval model of socially embedded use, for all its restrictions, offered something valuable. Your breathing is barely perceptible now. Consciousness beginning its gentle transition toward dreams. The economic dimensions of substance use haven't changed as much as we might think. In medieval times, valuable substances moved through trade networks, generated wealth, shaped economies. Today, legal and illegal drug markets remain major economic forces. The profits are different, the organizations changed, but the basic dynamic persists. Substances people want create economic opportunities, and those opportunities attract enterprise, both legitimate and criminal. Medieval attempts to regulate through guilds and licensing find echoes in modern pharmaceutical regulation. Medieval failure to control smuggling and illicit production predicts modern difficulties with drug trafficking. The economic incentives are powerful, and simple prohibition has never been able to overcome them fully. The harm reduction insight that we should focus on minimizing damage rather than eliminating use entirely has medieval precedents. Medieval authorities often took pragmatic approaches, recognizing they couldn't eliminate alcohol use and focusing instead on managing its worst consequences. Licensing of taverns, regulations about serving, designated spaces for drinking, all aimed at harm reduction rather than prohibition. We've forgotten these lessons in some of our modern drug wars, insisting on elimination rather than management. The medieval pragmatic approach, accepting that use will happen and trying to make it less harmful, increasingly looks wise. Let's talk about one final aspect, the role of curiosity and experimentation. Medieval people experimented with consciousness alteration, trying new plants and combinations, observing effects, documenting results. This experimentation was dangerous. People died from it, but it also expanded knowledge, discovered medicines, and opened new possibilities. We continue this tradition, though with better safety measures and more systematic approaches, clinical trials, careful dosing, informed consent. All improvements on medieval trial and error. But the fundamental process continues, humans exploring the possibilities of consciousness through careful, systematic experimentation with substances that alter it. Your mind floats now in that space between waking and sleeping. Consciousness itself transforming. As you rest on the edge of dreams, let's acknowledge what this journey has really been about. Not just medieval history or pharmacology, but the ongoing human conversation with consciousness itself. Every generation asks, what is this mind we inhabit? What are its possibilities? How can we change our experience of being? What relief can we find from suffering? What meaning can we discover? What pleasures can we access? What dangers must we avoid? Medieval people asked these questions with the tools. They had gardens and herbals, monasteries and markets, prayers and potions. We ask the same questions with different tools, laboratories and prescriptions, therapies and studies, policies and programs. But the questions remain constant because they arise from the fundamental human condition. We are conscious beings, aware of our consciousness, curious about it, sometimes uncomfortable in it, always exploring its boundaries. The substances we've discussed tonight, from henbane to hashish, from belladonna to bread, are tools in this exploration. Not the only tools, perhaps not even the best tools, but tools humans have always used and likely always will. The medieval relationship with these tools was complex, contradictory, often hypocritical. Ours is too. We condemn some substances while accepting others. We celebrate consciousness alteration in some contexts while criminalizing it in others. We seek relief from suffering through approved chemicals while imprisoning people for using unapproved ones. The contradictions persist, suggesting we haven't fully resolved the tensions medieval people grappled with. Perhaps we never will. Perhaps these tensions are inherent in the challenge of being conscious beings with the power to alter consciousness. We want the relief and pleasure that altered states provide, but we fear the loss of control and potential for harm. We value the freedom to make our own choices, but we recognize that some choices harm ourselves and others. Settling into the final depth of peace now, ready for dreams. We seek meaning and transcendence, but we distrust experiences that take us too far from ordinary reality. These tensions won't be resolved by better policies or more knowledge alone. They're built into the human situation. What we can do is approach them with wisdom, humility, and compassion. Wisdom to recognize that simple solutions don't exist, that different approaches work better in different contexts, that we must constantly balance competing goods and lesser evils. Humility to acknowledge the limits of our understanding, to admit when we're wrong, to change policies when they clearly aren't working. Compassion for those who struggle with substances, recognizing that judgment and punishment rarely help, that most people using substances are seeking relief or meaning, not trying to cause harm. Medieval people had less wisdom than we do in some ways, more in others. They lacked our scientific knowledge, but often showed more compassion for human weakness. They had crueler punishments, but also more realistic expectations about human behavior. They wrapped use in more restrictions, but also provided more acceptable contexts. We can learn from their successes and failures, adding their experience to our own ongoing experiment in living with consciousness-altering substances. Tonight, as sleep finally embraces you completely, carry this understanding forward. You are part of the long human story of consciousness exploration. Your choices about substances, whether you use them or not, are part of the ongoing conversation about how humans should relate to these powerful tools. the medieval people we've met tonight, mixing herbs by candlelight, drinking in taverns, seeking visions in monasteries, accidentally tripping on bread, all were asking the same questions you ask. How do I live with pain? Where do I find meaning? How do I connect with others? What pleasures are worth pursuing? What risks are worth taking? Their answers were their own, shaped by their time and place. Your answers will be shaped by yours. But you're connected across centuries by the shared human experience of consciousness and its possibilities. Rest now, gentle soul, in the knowledge that you're never alone in these questions. That generations before and after you grapple with the same mysteries, that the human conversation about consciousness continues, each generation adding its voice. You've added yours simply by engaging with these questions, by seeking understanding rather than settling for easy answers, by recognizing the complexity of substance use throughout history. Good night, dear traveler through history and consciousness. Sleep well, knowing that medieval gardens no longer threaten, that their experiments inform our safety, that their mistakes teach our caution, that their curiosity inspires our continuing exploration. May your dreams be gentle, your rest complete, your consciousness ready to return tomorrow to its ordinary state, enriched by this journey through time and human experience. The ancient world of herbs and ointments fades now into history where it belongs, leaving only lessons and understanding. Only connection across centuries, only the recognition of shared humanity. May the gentle rhythm of centuries rock you into the deepest sleep, where all questions rest, where all tensions resolve, where consciousness itself relaxes into peace. Good night. Sleep well, and may you wake refreshed, grateful for modern medicine, understanding toward those who struggle, connected to the long human story of seeking relief and meaning in whatever forms we find them. The medieval world whispers its final blessing as you sleep. We were human. As you are human, seeking answers to the same eternal questions about consciousness, suffering, meaning, and joy, rest now in that shared humanity, that connection across time.